Hello. In this edition of Writing Notes, we're going to talk about profiles. So I had done a video on profiles before, but I'm not really happy with it. So this video is going to be a little more in-depth, and it's going to talk about some of the strategies that we may use when we're composing a profile. So to start out with, let's talk about what a profile is. Basically, a profile is the story of a noun. Now, that's not a very helpful description as descriptions go. So a profile tells the story, gives an overall impression, or makes an argument about a particular subject. Often this is a person or a place, an organization, something like this. So we can think about biographies or autobiographies. The About Me section on an individual's website, or the About Us section on a corporate website, or an organization's website, a nonprofit's website, whatever it is. So these give descriptive information about that subject, about that person, that organization, whatever it is. A lot of Wikipedia pages are going to be profiles, more or less. So you go to, say, Abraham Lincoln's Wikipedia page, and gives you information about Lincoln. It tells the story of him. If you go to Margaret Thatcher's webpage, if you go to Uganda's webpage, if you go to the National Park Foundation Wikipedia page, these are all going to be telling the story of that particular person, organization, country, whatever it is. So, so that's the basic idea behind a profile. Now, profiles tend to have a particular focus or a particular purpose. So this is one thing that we want to keep in mind when we're writing profiles, is what do we want to convey about this particular subject? So I used an example in my previous video about profiles of Alan Alda's autobiography, Never Have Your Dog Stuffed, and Other Things I've Learned. What we get as we read this autobiography, which is a type of profile, is that every experience Alda talks about contributes to his acting process. So everything that's discussed, he somehow takes and either uses it to become a better actor or uses it to become a better writer or whatever it is. Now, this is not how real life works. There's a lot of random stuff that happens to us that we don't in any way internalize or make sense of, or that doesn't in any way contribute to who we are as people. Or there's a lot of random stuff. For instance, if you went to Nicaragua's webpage, there's a lot of random things that have happened in Nicaragua that aren't important. Or sorry, if you went to Nicaragua's Wikipedia page, there's a lot of random stuff that's happened in Nicaragua that's simply not important enough to make the cut for telling the story of Nicaragua. So this is one of the things that we want to think about when we're writing profiles, is we want to make sure that whatever we choose to include fits within the specific story that we're telling, which means a lot of stuff is going to get left out. So, that being said, let's talk about some ways that you can approach profiles, some ways that you can organize your argument. So, the most basic, sort of fundamental approach to a profile is what I call the straight biography profile. So this is essentially a usually chronological, sort of story of the subject. Wikipedia pages tend to do this. Any sort of encyclopedia entry that tends to do this. The goal of the straight biography is to give information about the subject without necessarily making a controversial argument. Now, one thing that the straight biography does tend to do, and this is where it does actually make an argument, is it tends to identify the things that are most significant about the subject. So, if you go to, say, Fyodor Dostoevsky's Wikipedia page, for instance, this is mostly straight biography, but if you look at the beginning, if you look at the opening paragraph or couple of paragraphs or whatever it is, before you get to the table of contents and stuff, that's going to identify the most important things about Dostoevsky. Here are the key characteristics that you should take away from this profile, from this biography, from this Wikipedia page. So that's the thing with straight biography, is even though it's informative primarily, its goal is ultimately to give the reader information, it's still usually making an argument about what the most important pieces of information or the most important characteristics of this subject are. So that's one technique that you can use for writing a profile. A second technique is what Aristotle calls epideictic rhetoric, or ceremonial rhetoric. This is also called encomium or invective. So basically this is a profile that praises or critiques. So often eulogies, for instance, are going to be encomia. They're going to be ceremonial rhetoric. Rhetoric that praises the person who has died. As I'm making this video, John Lewis, civil rights icon and long-term congressperson, just recently died. His funeral was televised. There were a lot of great speeches there. These would be a type of profile, or at least the speeches that give information about him and his legacy. This is a type of profile. Back when I was in my master's program, almost more than 10 years ago now. Wow, that's sad. That makes you feel old. But back when I was in my master's program, I think it was, Miley Cyrus did a performance at the VMAs, and it was the one, if you remember, where she was in like a flesh-colored outfit and gyrating with a foam finger and doing whatever. And there was a massive controversy. Half the country, maybe half the world, was like, she shouldn't be doing that. Hannah Montana should be wholesome, and this is bad. And that was invective. That was what we call invective, which is profiles that critique, criticism of the subject. But then the other half of the country was like, don't slut-shame Miley Cyrus, because she's an adult and she can do what she wants. And those were more along the lines, maybe not necessarily of encomium, because they weren't necessarily praising her. Some people were. Some people were just saying, don't critique her. Anyway, long story short, this is one approach that profiles often take, is they either try and present their subject very positively or very negatively. So that's another technique you can use for profiles. And then the third technique that I tend to talk about with profiles, and that I teach my students, is the profile that confronts a misconception. And this is a fairly common technique when there's a well-known subject that people think they know. So all of these sort of, a great example is Michael Jackson. All of these sort of, you thought you knew the king of pop, but actually he was this serial child molester or whatever it is. All of those type stories, whether or not he was, I'm not weighing in on it, but those type of stories are the profile that confronts a misconception. You think you know the real Michael Jackson, but here's what you don't know. So these kinds of stories, the argument fundamentally that they make is that the impression you have of this subject, and again, it has to be a well-known subject that your reader could reasonably be expected to know something about. The thing that you think you know about this subject is in some way incorrect. So for me, those are the three main types of profiles I tend to talk about. The straight biographical profile, the profile that praises or critiques, and the profile that confronts a misconception. Again, all of these are ways of telling the story of a particular subject. It just depends on what direction you want to go with that subject.